action.
Hello learners. In the previous session, we talked about the political background of the Romantic movement. In today's session, we'll be talking about the literary background of the Romantic movement. We'll begin by talking about the characteristics of Romanticism. Thereafter, we'll proceed to discussing the pre-Romantics of the Romantic movement. Following this, we'll be talking about the first generation of Romantic poets. Finally, we'll be talking about the second generation of Romantic poets. Now, one of the easiest ways to understand the difference between Neoclassicism and Romanticism is by drawing a table and listing the features of both. First and foremost, let's talk about the difference in the guiding principle. Whereas in Neoclassicism, the focus was on reason, order, restraint, and objectivity. In Romanticism, the focus is on imagination, emotion, intuition, and feeling. Now, there's also a difference in the aim of poetry in both. Whereas in Neoclassicism, you'll see that the poets followed the Horatian principle of art as a mirror to society, whose aim is to instruct and please. In Romanticism, you'll see that poetry reflects on the corrupt and chaotic present day by contrasting it with an ideal past. Society is depicted not as it is, but as it could be in the future. Now, when we talk about the difference in the relationship of society with poetry and the poet, in Neoclassicism, we'll see that poetry is not genuine if it is personal. Society is more important than the feelings of an individual poet. Poetry is seen as the aesthetic expression of the social order. Now, for the Romantic poet, he wrote as he pleased because he was opposed to obedience, authority, rules of composition, decorum, or custom. Emphasis was on the inner life, dreams, reveries, and the unconscious mind of the poet. Poetry was seen as the medium for the expression and celebration of human freedom, and indeed the celebration of the human soul itself. Now, when we talk about the difference in language, we see that there is an emphasis on formal perfection. Insofar as neoclassical poetry is concerned, it also employs sophisticated literary language. In Romanticism, language is more typical of common usage. In terms of the difference in the type of characters in neoclassical versus Romantic poetry, you will see that in Neoclassicism, because the poets depended on patronage from the aristocracy, so characters tended to be public figures who pleased the aristocratic audience. In Romanticism, the poet is a crusader for social and political justice who identifies with people from the margins like the peasant, the laborer, the shepherd, outcasts such as Prometheus, Don Juan. Sometimes the poet himself is a character, and often the whole of humanity is replaced by nature itself as a character. In terms of the difference in the attitude towards children, we see that in neoclassical poetry, poets believe that children need to be disciplined, they need to be civilized in order to conform to the dictates of society. Whereas in Romantic poetry, the poets believed that children were uncorrupted by the constraints of civilized reason. Therefore, children are seen as sacred because they are the closest creatures to God and thus closest to the source of creation. In terms of the difference in the verse form, we see that heroic couplet was the most popular verse form during the neoclassical period, whereas in the Romantic period, we see the emergence of, in fact, the re-emergence of the ballad, the lyric, the romantic couplet, the sonnet, the blank verse, ottava rima, and the Spenserian stanza. Now let's begin our discussion on the precursors of Romanticism. Before we move on to the precursors of Romanticism, it's important to define what is meant by the Romantic Revival. Now, there exists a period of transition roughly between 1750 to 1798, which eventually leads up to the start of Romanticism. The start of Romanticism being the publication of the lyrical ballads. Now, during this period, a series of poets, that is, the precursors, deviated from the neoclassical norms, and interest in Spenser, Shakespeare, and Milton was revived. These poets turned to the medieval and Renaissance period for their subject matter, literary themes, as well as genres that had long fallen out of use. During this transition period, various literary forms were revived. Also, we see that there was an increased interest in the past, in nature, and the poor. Now, an important, and in fact, I would say that the first poet that we should discuss as a precursor in the Romantic Revival period is James Thomson. He is often called the poet of pictorial landscape for a study of the influence of landscape poetry on painting. For a study of the influence of landscape painting on poetry, you must see Elizabeth W.M. Mainwaring's Italian Landscape in 18th Century England, which was published in 1925. Now, his most famous poem is The Seasons, that was published between 1726 to 30, and a series of 4 poems. He accorded 1 poem to each season. Winter appeared in 1726, summer in 1727, spring in 1728, and autumn in the complete edition of 1730. The Castle of Indolence, which was published in 1748, revived interest in the Spenserian stanza, which was later used to great effect by both Byron and Keats. Yet another precursor of the Romantic Revival was Thomas Gray. He is most famously known for having published Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard, that was published in 1751. And this poem was supposedly inspired by a visit to the grave of his aunt. He is often held to be one of the graveyard poets, a term that was first used for a brand of poets and their poetry by William McNeill Dixon in the year 1898. Now, this is a group that comprises a number of other poets such as William Cowper and Oliver Goldsmith, and we'll be talking about these poets as we move on. Now, their contemplation on ruins, death, human mortality, and the afterlife provided a thematic context to the Gothic tradition, which was to develop in the coming years. Now, if you want to read more on the relationship between Romanticism and how these graveyard poets influenced the whole Romantic movement, you must see Eric Perisot's Graveyard Poetry, Religion, Aesthetics, and the Mid-18th Century Poetic Condition, which was published in 2013 by Ashgate Publications. Yet another precursor to the Romantic movement was Mark Akenside. Now, his Pleasures of Imagination is a long didactic poem, very, very famous, written in blank verse. For Akenside, beauty in the physical realm is an extension and outward manifestation of divine beauty. Akenside's lyric poetry represents his attempt to write the kind of verse which is described by pleasures. Many of his odes may be seen to reflect Akenside's attempt at reviving the Greek form of the lyric. Now, William Collins is the next precursor that we'll be talking about. He is known for his lyrical odes, which tended to be romantic in theme and neoclassical in form. He is best known for odes on several descriptive and allegorical subjects that was published in 1746. This is a collection of odes to fear, simplicity, pity, and other abstract subjects. His ode to evening is the forerunner of Keats's To Autumn. He is also remembered for Persian Eclogues that was published in 1742, revised and retitled as Oriental Eclogues in 1757. These eclogues are written in heroic couplets and depict an Oriental setting. Yet another precursor is Oliver Goldsmith. He was a poet, essayist, novelist, and dramatist. His most famous poem is The Deserted Village, that was published in 1770. It's a pastoral elegy written in heroic couplets, which expresses fear of the destruction of a village. The poem functions as a social commentary on the economic and political changes in the wake of the eviction of the poor peasantry from a village, the conversion of agricultural land into a landscape park, the greed of the landowners, the issue of private property, and the plight of the agrarian population that is forced to emigrate to the city and quit the rural way of life to embrace the urban. The poem evokes a sense of longing for country life by highlighting the corruption of city life. Yet another precursor is William Cowper. He was confined to a mental asylum and often ridden by religious doubts. He took solace in evangelical Christianity and eventually composed the Olney hymns in 1779 in collaboration with John Newton. One of his most famous poems is The Task, which was written in 6 books, and it was in blank verse. It fuses together the disparate themes of religious faith, the clergy's failings, nature's beauty and bounties, slavery, blood sports, and a variety of other subjects in order to create a socio-critical piece of art. In a letter to his publisher, Cowper famously said, give me a manly rough line with a deal of meaning in it, rather than a whole poem full of musical periods that have nothing but their oily smoothness to recommend them. The unadorned manly rough line here is a forerunner of the poetic diction of William Wordsworth, whereas the oily smoothness is an attack on the neoclassical literary style of Alexander Pope. Yet another precursor was George Crabbe. Now, he criticized Oliver Goldsmith's The Deserted Village, and in response to it, he wrote another poem called The Village. He believed that the depiction of village in Goldsmith's poem was too idyllic. Unlike Goldsmith, Crabbe sought to draw attention to the miseries and poverty of the rural population. The realistic narrative form of Crabbe's poetry describes the lives of the middle and working class people. Now, how was Crabbe's poetry a departure from neoclassical conventions? Firstly, Augustans did not generally appreciate narrative poetry as they were not given to description but instead to generalization. Secondly, Augustan poets focused on aristocratic characters and not the lower or the middle classes. Now, Crabbe's collections of poems include The Burrow, Tales, and Tales of the Hall. An important poet and in fact an early pioneer of the Romantic movement was Robert Burns. His poems tend to be adaptations or revisions of the folk songs of Scotland. It would perhaps be incorrect to classify Burns as a regional poet because even though his poems contain local people and situations, yet he stresses upon the elemental, the universal, and the various moods and thoughts of the whole humanity. Notable poems are Old Lang Syne, Tom O'Shanter, and Red Red Rose. Now, some of his themes include Scottish patriotism, radicalism, republicanism, gender roles, class inequalities, and the contrasting ideas of birth, death, youth, old age, love, and grief. Now we move on to the first generation of Romantic poets. Let's begin with William Blake. Now, he occupies a very interesting position within the history of Romanticism because William Blake is both a precursor as well as a first generation Romantic. Why so? Because some of his works were published prior to the official start of the Romantic movement, which is prior to 1798, whereas the rest of his works were published after the start of the Romantic movement. He was an engraver, painter, and poet whose notable works include Songs of Innocence, Songs of Experience, the first book of Urizen, as well as Milton. Now, he constructed a mythology of his own centered on Urizen. Who is Urizen? He's not the benevolent God of the Bible, but instead the embodiment of law and reason. He's often depicted as a bearded old man who carries nets and the architect's tools in order to entrap the common man in the traditional conventions of society. Urizen is therefore a god who creates as well as constrains man. Now, as far as Blake is concerned, he was fundamentally dissatisfied with society, which in his opinion lacks the power of imagination and feeling. He thinks that it is the poet who, however, possesses these powers and therefore can be called a visionary. Thus, Blake portrays the artist as the hero of society and suggests the possibility of redemption from the Urizenic or fallen condition. Blake wrote with a didactic intention as he considered the poet to be a visionary who possessed the powers of imagination and uncorrupted feeling which was lacked by society. One of the first poets also to romanticize children, childhood represents not only a particular age but also a state of the soul, an innocent view of life. Among his famous symbols are children, flowers, lamb, and the twin symbols of seasons and industrial landscapes. Now let's talk about the second poet within the history of the second generation of Romantic poets, and it is William Wordsworth. Now the first edition of the Lyrical Ballads was published jointly by Wordsworth and Coleridge in 1798. It is generally held to mark the beginning of the Romantic period. The preface to the second edition is seen as the unofficial manifesto of the Romantic movement. Wordsworth advocates the use of poetic diction, which he defines as language near to the language of men. A supporter of the French Revolution, Wordsworth's poems describe the pathos of the human fate and the limitless unrealized possibilities that lie within the whole of mankind. What is his vision of nature? Wordsworth is famously known for his pantheism, that is, his belief in and depiction of the sacred quality in all objects across the cosmos. For him, there is consciousness in nature and in all natural objects. Contrary to Wordsworth's central to Wordsworth's vision of nature is the importance of its influence on the human mind and the mind of the poet in particular. His poetry describes the world of nature as it exists outside, but is particularly interested in the inside effect that it has on him. That is the response of his senses and of the inward eye. Among his notable works are Tinton Abbey, Daffodils, The Solitary Reaper, The Excursion, and The Prelude. Let's come to the third poet within the first generation of Romantic poets, which is Samuel Taylor Coleridge. He was a poet, preacher, playwright, theorist, and literary critic who coined the famous phrase, willing suspension of disbelief. Among his notable works are Dejection and Ode, Kubla Khan, Christabel, and other poems, as well as Biographia Literaria. He creates a universe where realistic and supernatural elements coexist within mysterious and dreamlike landscapes. His language is characterized by the frequent use of alliteration, internal rhymes, similes, and personifications. Coleridge's language tends to be unlike that of Wordsworth. It is influenced by the language of medieval ballads and often contains archaic words. Taken together, Blake, Wordsworth, Coleridge, that is the first generation Romantics, were essentially concerned with changing the intellectual climate of the age by contrasting it against the erstwhile state of man in his natural state and in the lap of nature. Now, a brief note on the Lake poets. This is a very famous term when you read the history of Romanticism. Who were the Lake poets? The term derives itself from the Lake District of England and is generally associated with the following three poets who lived there, which is Robert Southey, William Wordsworth, and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Now, when speaking about the group, Francis Jeffrey, a Scottish literary critic, referred to them as the school of whining and hypochondriacal poets that haunt the lakes in the Edinburgh Review of 1816. The term was thus employed by Jeffrey in a contemptuous and derogatory manner. This group of poets is also sometimes referred to as the bards of the lake. The group followed no singularly unified or specific literary practice or school of thought that was common to all the three poets. Now we move on to the second generation of Romantic poets, and we'll start off by talking about Lord Byron. Now, Lord Byron created the literary stereotype of the Byronic hero, a term that entered the English language. It became part of the English language after the publication of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, which was a semi-autobiographical work. This work introduced the Byronic hero. What are some of the characteristics of this literary stereotype? Now, the Byronic hero is typically a handsome, solitary young man inclined to melancholy, endowed with a sense of ironic humor, who charts his own trajectory of life against convention and fights for lost causes. The most famous Byronic hero is Don Juan, who appears in the mock epic poem Don Juan, which was published between 1819 to 24, written in 17 cantos in Ottawa Rima form. Byron uses the amorous adventures of his hero to satirize the moral codes of the English society. Among his other notable works are The Bride of Abydos, The Corsair, Manfred, and Cain. Now, the second Romantic poet within the second generation of Romantic poets is John Keats. He is famous for his odes that are written either in praise or in dedication to a person or a thing he admires. Unlike Wordsworth or Shelley, Keats's poetry has little moral or political purpose because he does not view the poet as a political figure who uses poetry as a vehicle to express his views. Keats shares some of Coleridge's interest in the fantastic and the supernatural. It is the sensuous qualities of poetry and its capacity to create an autonomous world constructed entirely out of the possibilities inherent in language which appeal to him. Now, what are some of his themes? They are beauty, nature, death, suffering, and the immortality of art. A number of his poems are derived from Greek mythology and medieval sources, where he contrasts the transience of human life with the eternity of nature and the eternity of art. So, in this sense, if you see, his poetry anticipates the art for art's sake tendency of the 19th century, from Baudelaire to the aesthetics of Walter Pater and Oscar Wilde. Among his notable works are Ode on a Grecian Urn, Ode to a Nightingale, La Belle Dame Summer Sea, and The Fall of Hyperion. Finally, we come to the last poet in the second generation of Romantic poets, which is Shelley, who famously said that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. Now, Shelley was a political radical who rebelled against social and political values of his society in all forms, including institutions of marriage, family, and the church. For Shelley, the poet possesses exemplary moral power because he can create new humane values by observing the current social order and reimagining a new social order. In this way, each poetic mind for Shelley recreates its own universe. Thus, Shelley saw the poet's role as that of a prophet and believed in the power of poetry to reform the world. Characteristic images in his poetry include light, fire, and sky. Among his notable works are Ozymandias, Ode to the West Wind, The Mask of Anarchy, to a Skylark, Prometheus Unbound, and the beautiful, beautiful Adonais, which is in commemoration of the death of Keats. In terms of the timeline, the first generation romantics were born 30 and 20 years preceding 1800, and this is something you must remember. Whereas the second generation romantics were born in the last decade of the 1800s. Also, the second generation romantics died early, and so the first generation was still on the literary scene, still writing during the time that the second generation was publishing their works. In today's session, we began by comparing and contrasting features of the poetry written by the neoclassicists with that of the romantics. Now, differences in terms of theme, function of poetry, language, and attitude to children were listed one after the other. We then discussed a series of poets who were writing in the transition period prior to the so-called start of Romanticism, which is held to occur with the publication of Lyrical Ballads in 1798. A total of 8 poets, their major works and contributions, how they departed from neoclassical norms and or influenced some of the first and generation romantic poets who were to arrive later. All this was briefly dwelt upon alongside a quick definition of the term Romantic Revival. In the process of discussing the Romantic Revival, the figure of Thomas Gray was contextualized against the background of the Graveyard School of Poetry and how these poets enacted as the precursors to the Gothic tradition. Finally, we catalogued the first and second generation Romantic poets, their major works, stylistic features, themes, and so on and so forth. In between the first and second generation, we also briefly mentioned the late poets. So learners, this is all for today's session. Thank you for listening.